Hey, friends, it is the greatest pleasure of all for me to introduce our next keynote speaker, Chana Kronfeld, who is the Bernard Williams Professor of Hebrew, Yiddish, and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Berkeley. Kronfeld specializes in modernist poetry in Hebrew, Yiddish, and English, but also in translation theory, theory of intertextuality, metaphor theory, stylistics, gender studies, and much more. As a champion both of theory and of close reading, Kronfeld has trained dozens of students in the fields of Hebrew and Yiddish studies. We can, I think, rightfully say that thanks to Chana Kronfeld, we can speak of a Berkeley school and of a true Berkeley yeshiva. And as a researcher, Kronfeld has published numerous studies on Peretz Markish, Itzik Manger, David Fogel, Dalia Rabikovich, Dvora Baron, Yehuda Amichai, Benjamin Harshav, and many more. In her work, she pays particular attention to the joint historiography of Hebrew and Yiddish literatures. And she is currently working on a book titled The Land as Woman, the Afterlife of a Biblical Metaphor. Her talk today is titled Beyond Untranslatability, Yiddish, Hebrew, and Harshav's Collected Poetry. Chana, the floor is yours.
Schönen Dank, Tal und Allemen. Let me start by stating the obvious for this audience, because it is the obvious that often remains unstated. The modernist Yiddish and Hebrew poetry I study, translate, and as Tal said, insist on reading together, emerges out of an age-old tradition of translational textual commentary produced by and for multilingual Jewish communities. This is very much the case also for other exegetical cultures of commentary, especially those in Muslim lands, which have their own distinct textual and intertextual practices, yet have historically been in bilateral translational dialogue with Jewish exegetical traditions. I want to begin by asserting this common basis, dafke, for Ashkenazi Yiddish, because European colonialism and Zionist Hebraism have done their best to make us forget these shared traditions. And because, when taken together, Jewish and Muslim cultures of commentary threaten to consolidate into a formidable body of texts that motivates a radical re-theorizing of translation as well as of other forms of rewriting. Translation has always been the first step in a never-ending process of exegetical rewriting of the Hebrew Bible, circulating between the Hebrew source text and Aramaic, Yiddish, Judeo-Spanish, Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Persian, and other Jewish languages. Translation is indeed the prototypical Jewish intertextual practice, alongside allusion, pastiche, parody, and specifically Jewish rhetorical strategies and genres that undergird the history of Yiddish literature. These rhetorical strategies include the anachronistic medrash, the maise and moshel, and the poetic figure of shibutz, the musif stil or mosaic-like insertion of biblical verses in surprising, often irreverent combinations and contexts developed in dialogue with classical Arabic and Persian rhetoric, but perfected parodically in Yiddish, as for example by Sholem Aleichem and Tevye's obsessive pseudo-non sequitur translations of Lashon Kodesh verses into Yiddish. The modern poets I work with are mostly secular and often blatantly iconoclastic in their translational treatment of the biblical and rabbinic tradition. but interpretive translations from biblical and Mishnaic Hebrew Aramaic into modern Yiddish or Hebrew, as well as exegetical intertextuality and the citational mode in general, remain a formal and, I would agree, an ethical matrix. Writing is always rewriting. In traditional Jewish textual practice, translation as interpretation in both senses of interpret is not only deemed essential, but also valorized. This pulls out the rug from under debates about translatability and untranslatability, spearheaded in France by Barbara Cassin and in the US by Emily Apter, debates that are so fashionable today in Eurocentric translation studies as they attempt to deal with their marginalized others. So, you know, the series of dictionaries of untranslatables. You can look it up if you haven't been pulled into this maelstrom. For Yiddish literature, as for Jewish textual culture in general, the opposition between translatability and untranslatability is all but culturally moot. Theorized from the example of cultures of commentary, translation studies would, as I've argued elsewhere, be compelled to get beyond the existential anxieties about secondariness and lack of originality, and reveal that even in the European context, these are relatively recent developments, vestiges of, I think, a misconstrued reductive interpretation of Romanticism and its fixation on the bourgeois individual original author. It is commonly believed that translations of European classics into Yiddish are accompanied by the label verteidigt und verbessert, translated, interpreted, and improved. As Anita Norwich, who is here and I thought wouldn't be here, so I wrote this before I knew she would be here, but we're continuing our long-standing dialogue. As Anita reminds us, in 2005, we even held a conference by that name at Berkeley on translating Yiddish culture. But it turns out, die ganze Meise ist ausgesogen von Fingel. Anita Norwich and Michael Stanislavski have pointed out that scholars have been hard-pressed to come up with a single example of such title pages, even though it is repeated again and again. Here, for example, is Anita's example, Peter Maison. What she doesn't tell us is that this guy is, you know, he's not just somebody, some schmo writing in the New Yorker. He is the curator of American religious history for the Smithsonian and a winner of the National Jewish Book Award. This is what he says in a New Yorker interview. It was, quote, "It was not uncommon to see on the title page of Yiddish translations of Shakespeare or Dickens, the words verteidigt und verbessert." Now listen to this. As if some anonymous Yiddish scribbler got his hands on King Lear and thought, I'll just punch it up a bit, end quote, right? He's very satisfied with himself about this. The ignorant suggestion that Yiddish translations of Shakespeare were some anonymous scribbler's glosses over the massive literary translation projects undertaken by some of the major Yiddish writers and dramaturgs from at least the middle of the 19th century through the interwar period. I mean, it's really grotesque, and we've heard a lot about these. Let me just mention Yosh's translations of hundreds of works of world literature, including his 1910 translation of Longfellow's Hiawatha, which Arnaud mentioned on Monday, Bashevis's 1929 early translation of Remarque's All is Quiet on the Western Front that Ellie discussed, poet Judith Schwarz's 1921 translation of Julius Caesar, right, the anonymous scribbler rewriting Shakespeare, Aaron Einhorn's masterful translation of Molière's L'Avare for Zygmunt Turkov's Yiddish Art Theater, not the Schlock Theater. I'm sorry, I still have that distinction. Lamet Shapiro's translations of Dickens, perhaps the most translated English writer into Yiddish, and it's interesting, studies have been done on why Dafka Dickens, Leibnidis's anthology of Russian poetry into Yiddish, etc., etc. More than sheer ignorance, Peter Manceau's flippant tone here presupposes that it is self-evident that Yiddish is culturally inferior to English, and that no Yiddish work is comparable to the masterpieces of the English canon. But the chutzpahdik view of Yiddish translation, chutzpahdik here is Anita's term, that this apocryphal story articulates is, I would argue, quite meaningful. It is entirely consistent with a culture that does not see itself as marginal or inferior, and moreover, that entrusts translation with improving our understanding, verbessern, of the source text, without laying claim to providing one definitive and authoritative rendition, hence the multiple translations of the same text, if you look into it. In this respect, this Yiddish folk theory of translation as interpreting and improving the source text articulates boldly, irreverently, the egalitarian, dialogical view of translation that Westernization has made Jewish literary history forget, and we saw some of the vestiges of that today. What has been forgotten is that the dialogical proliferation of different versions of the source text constitutes the very basis of textual study in rabbinic discourse, I would argue in Jewish discourse. In the Talmud, as Daniel Boyarin was the first to clarify, a debate over the meaning or exegetical translation of the Hebrew text that results in one definitive take is considered fatally flawed argumentation and is technically labeled an impasse, kushia, hence the Yiddish kashe. Only once the multiple versions of Aramaic translations, interpretations, etc., of the Hebrew are restored, does Talmudic logic deem a solution a teretz, terutz. While the exegetical process is supposed to follow the recipe Shnai Mikra ve'echad Tirgum, 2 parts biblical Hebrew, 1 part translation exegesis in a Jewish language, in effect, the translation cum exegesis takes over. As you can see from any page of Mikraot Gdolot, often called in English the Rabbinic Bible, the basic text for Torah study, and in Tal's presentation on the first day, we saw that that is replicated in the Yiddish commentaries and translations. So what we have there is, a really small, short Hebrew passage, even if they printed in much larger font, surrounded by notes on the Masoretic text, but first of all, the Hebrew Aramaic Targum, or translation of the Hebrew passage, and later commentaries throughout the ages. These discursive practices, I argue, have continued to profoundly inform modern Yiddish and Hebrew poetry, at least partially inoculating them against Western dichotomies between original and translation that we're so bothered by today, even as Jewish cultures became increasingly Europeanized and Americanized. And despite Zionist investment in imposing a Hebrew monolingualism, cultural multilingualism, and internal translation remained a seldom acknowledged but nevertheless powerful norm in Hebrew literature as well. And Yael Havel is here, who wrote the book on the subject. What is at stake for me here is a point of theory. The contemporary study of translation in the West would benefit from an alternative model represented by Yiddish and other cultures of commentary. Translation, I have argued, cannot be theorized separately from allusion, parody, or other forms of rewriting, such as anthologizing and, yes, interpretation. Teitschen, verteitschen, und durch dem tak je euch etwas verbessern. Seeing translation under the umbrella of intertextual practices would work, however, only if we re-theorize intertextuality itself, as I've suggested elsewhere, taking it beyond conflictual hierarchical models of influence on the one hand, and agentless, ahistorical models of intertextuality on the other. Using Yiddish culture as the model, we may end up with a theory that need not occasion anxiety or despair over translation. It really isn't about whose agon is bigger, sorry, Harold Bloom, may you rest in peace, or about our inability to step outside the anonymous tissue of citation, sorry, Yulia Kristeva, Tibadel Chaim Arukim. Reinscribing agency in a theory of intertextuality may highlight the open-ended, bilateral nature of the circulation involved in translation, as in other rhetorical practices, from allusion to metaphor. Both source and target text and target and source culture are opened up to rereading through rewriting. And that circulation needn't go from center to periphery as Pascal Casanova or Franco Moretti would have it, but can move, as Yiddish literary tradition often does, as queer theory instructs us it should, forward, backward, and sideways, perhaps even all at the same time. And that's one of the main reasons queer theory and queer Yiddish are so important in their intersection. I therefore propose to rethink translation as collaborative or cooperative labor, with the emphasis on the word labor, militating both against the invisibility of the translators, who are often underpaid or overworked women, but also collaborative labor as an alternative to the patriarchal metaphors of fidelity and betrayal and translation, which we really should make a point of abandoning. Ultimately, the work of collaboration is between the source and target languages, the source and target cultures. I was fortunate enough to have had that experience literally, or at least metonymically, as a dialogue between writer and translator, with Binyamin Harshav in collaborative translations of his poetry from Yiddish into Hebrew, and with Yehuda Amichai and Dalia Rabikovich, with whom Chana Bloch Zal and I worked closely on our English translations of their Hebrew poetry. Indeed, the most cherished part for me was collaborating with co-translators, going back to my working with Nomi Seidman on the Hebrew and Yiddish short stories of Dvorah Baron. Translation as collaborative labor is dialogical rather than dialectical. And I mean this in the special sense developed with great nuance by Bakhtin. In his book on Dostoevsky, Bakhtin writes, quote, "Every thought senses itself from the very beginning to be a rejoinder to an unfinalized dialogue. It lives a tense life on the border of someone else's thought, someone else's consciousness," end quote. Bakhtin's dialogism has all too often been understood as sentimental pluralism on the model of "I'm okay, you're okay" of American self-help books from the 60s. For Bakhtin, but also for the Jewish theory and practice of translation I am discussing here, the dialogical means the ability to read and understand the language of the other without pretending that it is your own, without blurring the differences between source and target text and culture, or the tensions that such differences produce. As Zali Gurevich has shown, Bakhtin's notion of the dialogical implies responding to the silences between the language, building a linguistic bridge between them, while also acknowledging fissures or breaks. The prevalence of anachronistic, parodic rewriting in Yiddish translations of biblical stories, for example, from Old Yiddish to Itzik Mangil, is an expression precisely of such an awareness of difference. We are supposed to acknowledge with a wink that Mangil's Medrash, in Mangil's Medrash Itzik, that Sarah, Sore, is not a shtetl pushke gabete, right? And in his Megillah Lieder, that Fastrigose, the revolutionary tailor's assistant who is in love with Esther, is not part of the Esther scroll. Manger's texts rely on us to experience and enjoy the ways in which the sacred source text is changed in translation. And so did old Yiddish rewritings of biblical stories. Interpretation, indeed improvement, resides in the community of readers, hearers, recognizing that tension, responding to the difference between then and now, between here and there, between biblical Hebrew stories and their modern Yiddish translation, which are themselves translations of old Yiddish translations in the dual traditions of the exegetical Maise and the parodic Purim spiel. These brief examples should caution us against the common tendency to apply contemporary translation theory, the same theory, universally. Up until recently, this has been done extensively with post-colonial translation theory developed, for example, by Tejaswini Niranjana and Mary Louise Pratt. These accounts work very well for the British imperial context in the Indian subcontinent or the North-South context zone in the Americas, for which they were developed respectively. But they're not universal by any stretch of the imagination. These theories were extremely useful, nevertheless, because they allowed us to develop a heightened awareness of the inequality, the asymmetry in power relations in translation between source and target culture. But they also were very misleading because they have often aligned translation as such with oppression and the erasure of agency. What the Yiddish-inspired translation model I'm envisioning opens up is modeling all writing on rewriting is very different indeed. Okay, a breath. In the second half of my comments today, now I'm telling you what I'm not going to do. I will not, this is called like totes, okay. I will not address the practical translation challenges I encountered in my co-translations of Benjamin Harshav's collected poetry from Yiddish into Hebrew. Challenges generated by the virtuosity of his language and prosody. I'll be happy to answer questions about this at the end and address some of the imperfect solutions I developed both in dialogue with Benjamin and after his death, as I was left to complete the translations on my own, including a most extraordinary crown of sonnets. I hesitate to use the technical term corona, given what's going on with the Magefe, which narrates, so this crown of sonnets written while he was a soldier in 48 as a refugee from Europe, right? It narrates from the point of view of a dying soldier, the 1948 war, and it's called In Speltel zwischen Kaske und Erd, in the crack between helmet and earth. It's just amazing. This is not what I will do now. Instead, I will look at a single poem by Harshav simply because I can never resist, as Tal suggested earlier, a close reading as a source for theorizing. And Tal, if you would please share the poem which you also had in your program. And it's a poem that Anita knows because we talked about it at a different context. So for this audience, I don't need to read my imperfect English literal translation, more or less literal translation. So it's a translation in progress. But you'll notice, you can't see it here, but at the very bottom, there is the asterisk is explained that what we have at the beginning is a mangled Yiddish idiom. Okay, the idiom is meretu meshushkitzach, and this is how the poem starts. So you can go back to the beginning. Thank you. That's why I didn't want to do it and talk at the same time. All right. מרד ומרד ומרד, ומרד 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 ומרד, ומשושקצח. Ergens bombelt sich an Intonatie. A Wort da, a Wort dort, der Herd, nicht der Herd. A paar Knetschen in die Satzen, feuchte Erd, eingebacken in alle Obsassen. Und der warme Teppicher kollierte Stäuben von amolike Schich. Und oben, auf die Marginessen von alle vergessen, kleppen sich Krischkelach ich. Auf die Marginessen von alle vergessen, kleppen sich Krischkelach ich. I'm just crazy about this poem. It gives me chills every time. Harshav's poem answers a question posed by his beloved friend and landsman and fellow survivor, the great Yiddish poet Avram Sutzkever, in a poem from the 1970s that has since become the title of a film about him. And this poem, Binyamin's poem, was published as part of a sequence from the 1970s, written just a couple of years after Sutzkever's. As it happens, that particular Sutzkever poem and the Harshav's translation of it are the subject of the opening discussion. And I really didn't know, Anita, that you're going to be here because you said you were not. In Anita Norwich's important book, Writing in Tongues, Translating Yiddish in the 20th Century. It's a book that we saw earlier today. The poignant refrain of Sutzkever's poem, Wer wird bleiben, was wird bleiben, is answered by his landsman Binyamin in this poem. First by, and then look at the poem while I'm reading, okay? First by acerbically citing what remains of the Yiddish language itself. The rich idiomatic Yiddish speech has been reduced by the senile culture of forgetting to bumbling mumbles. The mangled idiom for talking and saying nothing is itself painfully drawn out and distorted, signifying nothing. A Yiddish word here and there, a Yiddish turn of phrase, wrinkling up the smooth Hebrew or English syntax. The speech community is just as disjointed as the language itself. All that remains of it is rendered through almost indecipherable synecdoches in the middle of the poem, the caked dust clinging to their old shoes. The survivors were labeled human dust, avak adam, by Ben Gurion, and Stäuben was Harshav's, Binyamin's first poetry book, published in Germany right after the war. And dust continues to be a key word throughout his Yiddish and Hebrew oeuvre, avak. The survivors are never mentioned directly here, invoked only through suggestion and association. Their absence from the text, a formal evocation of the transient dust. But suggestion and association are the two major principles of the New York introspectivists, whose poetics, as we shall see, Harshav self-consciously carried over, hat übergesetzt, right? The literal meaning of übergesetzt, into to Israel and Israeli poetry. We don't see the people, just the haunting image of the shoes from over there, which somehow have ended up dragging the old mud into the comfortable carpeted rooms of the here and now, as if the colored dust swept proverbially under the rug are the pulverized remains of those disembodied shoes. But this is also the dust that these people themselves, whether victims or survivors, have now been equated with. Still, a redemptive possibility comes into view in the final 4 lines, as the gaze turns upwards in a typically introspectivist kaleidoscope of imagery, either up from the carpet towards the human beings wearing those shoes, or in a mock apotheosis to the horizons stretching across the margins of all cultural and linguistic forms of forgetting. die Marginessen von alle vergessen, where the crumbs of decimated selves or the crushed fragments of an I, right, the first person, stick together, kleppen sich, krishkelach ich. Not quite Ezekiel's resurrection of the dry bones, but at least a hint of a potential collectivity of broken people who resist isolation and erasure. The final rhyme in the poem is a typically introspectivist functional rhyme, rather than one dictated by a rhyme scheme, because there isn't one. As their 1919 manifesto cites, the reflexive and mutual pronoun sich, literally it would translate as something like glue themselves to each other, and the first person pronoun ich, here used as a noun to denote either the speaker's broken bits of self or those of others' fragmented eyes. Chana Kronfeld has suggested that the multilingual name tags under which he wrote, Hey Binyamin, Binyamina Rushovsky, Gabi Daniel, etc., are multilingual expressions of this krishkelach ich, granting his lifelong proper nameplay a much deeper meaning. But the sich ich rhyme also echoes, of course, the title of the introspectivist collection and journal, In sich. In fact, they're known as the Insichisten, where the unique inner self of the poet was programmatically affirmed as the only measure of reality. And you can take down the poem now. Thank you very much, Hashem Dank. Now I have to find where I am. Okay, where the unique inner self, so this is in the Insichisten in their manifesto, the inner self of the poet was programmatically affirmed as the only measure of reality, history, and artistic expression. With this one move, Harshav turns the poem retrospectively into a meta-poetic what remains, was wird bleiben. This poem then can be reread as a rueful meditation on what remains of the brilliant heritage of Yiddish modernism, a meditation that indicts his own poetic voice, including it in the pathetic senile chorus of mumblers and bumblers. But ultimately, on this retrospective reading too, the poem, like the other 820 pages of Harshav's collected poems we published in the summer of 2017 in Jerusalem, Farder Magefen, suggests that in one way or another, the crumbs of the Insich's legacy still stick together. And I think in the last bit of my comments today, I'll try to show how. Reformulating Sutzkever's question, Anita Norwich asks written in tongues, who and what will remain of Eastern European Jewish culture? What will remain of Yiddish? And she answers, one inescapable response is that translations will remain. And indeed, it was in the margins, not of forgetting, but of Harshav's own translations and the paratexts of the great, in the introductions and afterwards of his translations of the great New York Yiddish modernists into Hebrew and English, that some 17 years ago, I started following the breadcrumbs trail, which I felt he was leaving for us. And they led me beyond his own bilingual poetry, which I was familiar with, to his submerged role as translator mediator between the introspectivist poets of In sich and the Hebrew poets of the statehood generation, in whose founding group Likrat, Harshav played a central role. In his anthology, and I'm just giving a hint of all the numerous breadcrumbs that he leaves. In his anthology, Shira Modernit, Modern Poetry 1990, Harshav says of the chapter dealing with Yiddish modernism, this is a literature that used to be within the horizon of Hebrew literature, and is not sufficiently known, even though you can find it in some of the best poetry of the 20th. You can find it in some of the best poetry of the 20th century. He goes on to say, the poets of the introspectivist in sich trend in New York articulated in 1919 a manifesto that could perfectly describe the directions of Hebrew poetry in the 50s, end quote. Another breadcrumb, the anthology Introspectivism in New York, 1997, reveals that, quote, some of the poems of this anthology were translated in the early 1950s, that is in the Likrat, during the days of Likrat. He actually says that, end quote. Indeed, alternating between the names Binyamin Horushovsky and Hey Binyamin, he published in the early 1960s with the collaboration especially of Moshe Dor, who was a native Yiddish speaker, but others as well from Likrat, 3 volumes of Yiddish poetry in Hebrew translation during the height of the repression of bilingualism in the state period. There was, of course, a language war before the state. So Glanz Leoles, 1960, Moshe Leib Halper in 1961, and Sutzkevel, 1964. Translations that we found out he worked on with several of his Likrat comrades in the early 1950s, but Mossad Bialik wouldn't publish it then. These translations introduced readers and poets of the statehood generation, even those who didn't read Yiddish or pretended not to the extraordinary, sophisticated, and diverse production of Yiddish modernist poetry. The contentious critics who viciously attacked Likrat in the early 1950s for importing dangerous foreign influences may have unwittingly been onto something that only today begins to be speakable, that the first Israeli phase of modern Hebrew poetry was mediated by, indeed partially modeled on, not only the corrupting influence of Anglo-American westernizing trends, as the contemporary attack had it, but also on the once flourishing international Yiddish modernism, Hebrew culture's silent partner. Benjamin Harshav is the one who imported the model of Yiddish modernism into the heart of Israeli modernism. And at the time, not a lot of translation was needed, but eventually it did come out as translations. I cannot go into a detailed comparison here of the explicit and implicit poetics of both trends, but let me just signal towards a couple of salient connections. The importance of rhythmic suspense in the poetics of Likrat and the statehood generation has always been attributed to Zach's Nathan Zach's Anglo-American modernist models, and he was not a Yiddish speaker, and to his critique of Alterman's prosody. Thus, for example, Zach's 1966 epoch-making manifesto towards the stylistic climate of the 50s and 60s in our poetry, lists 15 points, which came to be known as Tetvav Nekudot, that are indeed closely related to Pound's 1913, A Few Don'ts by an Imagist. But as it turns out, at least 14 out of the 15 occur in one form or another in the In sich manifestos by the New York introspectivists, signed by Yankev Gladstein, Avrom Leoles, and Nachum Minkov, written some 6 years after Pound's. The In sichisten implicitly affiliate their stylistic principles with Pound's when they say, points we are unified about regarding writing style can also be found in the modernist trends such as American Imagists, end quote. But note that these same introspectivist manifestos were translated into Hebrew already in the early 1960s by Harshav himself, who was then a young instructor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem under Leah Goldberg's leadership, for use in his seminars, and appeared alongside the Imagist manifestos and numerous other manifestos and programmatic essays of the transnational avant-garde in a mimeographed, you guys don't know what that is, volume titled Heirs of symbolism in European and Jewish poetry, Yorsher Symbolism Bashira. This volume was treasured by generations of students and poets in Israel. When Harshav left the Hebrew U to found the Department of Poetics and Comparative Literature at Tel Aviv University in fall 1967, he brought this anthology with him. And as a 17-year-old student in that cohort, I got to study Yiddish modernism with him from this anthology, alongside Hebrew and all the transnational isms that no one else was putting together then, not only Hebrew and Yiddish, but Hebrew, Yiddish, and German Expressionism, and Russian Futurism, and Acmeism, et cetera, et cetera. Zach's 15-point manifesto was published a year after Harshav's collection of manifestos. And Zach, like other statehood generation poets and Likrat alums, attended Harshav's original modernism seminars in comparative literature at the Hebrew University in the early 60s, where this collection served as a textbook. Binyamin told me that Dalia Rabikovich would come from Tel Aviv with her mother to these seminars on modernism. But because the historiographies of Hebrew and Yiddish modernism have for the most part been kept separate for ideological reasons, it was only statehood generation's connection to the imagists, not to the Yiddish introspectivists, that Hebrew literary scholarship has recognized to date. Finally, the other major secret the breadcrumb trail has led me to, a trail which Shachar Pinsker, and Yaakov is here, has been pursuing assiduously for the past few years, and which we have each written about elsewhere, can only be summarized briefly here, and many of you know the story. It turns out that a year before he played a major role in the formation of Likrat, Harshav helped launch a Yiddish modernist group in Kibbutz Yagur in Israel, right, called Young Yisrael. The history of Young Yisrael as a precursor of Likrat and of Harshav's role as a translational smuggler of modernist Yiddish poetics into the formative phase of statehood generation Hebrew poetry remained hidden for many years. When I discovered in 2004 an uncharacteristic error in dating in Harshav's memoirs of the Likrat period, claiming that it was launched in 1951 rather than 52, I realized immediately that something was afoot. Binyamin, I knew all too well, had a phenomenal memory. So something else must have happened in 1951 that he was part of. I then followed the breadcrumbs trail to David Roski's 1973, was very young then, series of essays on Young Yisrael. He was one of the few who wrote about it in English, and started putting together the various hints Harshavsky left in the introductions and afterwards to his translations of modernist Yiddish poetry into Hebrew and English, all of which led me to the first meeting of Young Yisrael in Kibbutz Yagur at the end of October 1951. At the same time, Shachar began reconstructing the group's activity, interviewing surviving participants and collecting extensive archival material. Neither of us could initially get Binyamin to admit to his participation in the Yiddish group. As an astonishing example of the depth of the repression of Yiddish in Israel, even on the part of one of its greatest practitioners, translators, and scholars. In the last years of his life, I was privileged to hear from Binyamin the heart-wrenching details about his parallel participation in the two groups, about the ambivalence and complexity that accompanied his life as a bilingual poet in a culture that erased Yiddish and its literary achievements. For example, Binyamin told me that to his wedding with his first wife, Lina, he invited friends from both literary circles, Moshe Dor, Aryeh Sivan, Natan Zach from Likrat, and Yossel Birstein, Avrom Brinzler, and Jungmann from Young Yisrael. But each group remained seated the whole time in separate rooms. This is during the Tzena, when you really had to find somebody who had 2 rooms, without any contact between them. Harshav's opening up about Jung Israel helped me and his son Udi persuade him to publish his collected poetry, translate all the Yiddish into Hebrew. There's a lot of Hebrew poetry that he wrote under the name Gabi Daniel, and publish a bilingual edition in 1 massive volume. Ichud Mishpachot, family reunification, we called it. Sadly, he did not live to see the book completed. He died on April 23, 2015, and I had to complete the Hebrew translations by myself. These submerged, and it's still denied even by Dan Meron and other people who review this and who know the truth. When they write reviews of the book in the Israeli press, they continue to pretend that he only wrote poetry until 48, when there is 820 pages of continuous, amazing Yiddish literary production, right, throughout. He had to publish his Yiddish poetry in Wales, okay, in the 70s. These submerged affinities and affiliations can have stayed invisible all these years only because of the ideological blinders, the restricted vision imposed by a monolingual pseudo-nativist historiography, where Yiddish and Hebrew literary histories were forcibly kept apart, ignoring the long joint history of their bilingual, indeed multilingual articulations. But as we are reminded by Harshav the poet, the abjected other language doesn't keep mum, showing its presence by sticking its tongue out at the speaker who pretends to have forgotten it, literalizing the idiom to highlight the metalinguistic meaning. And I will end with the one stanza from this poem called Sprachen. In Mittensatz, in Mittensprung, springt Reus aneinander loschen und weiß dir die Zung. Schönen Dank euch alle.
Thank you so much, Chana. I think what we will do now is I will pass the mic to Arnaud, who will take both questions and commentaries to the keynote, and comments and questions for the entire conference. So I let Arnaud decide how we are going to segue into the final discussion. Thank you so much, Chana and Arnaud. Go ahead.
Thank you, Tal. Thank you very much, Chana. It was really, really rich. It was it condensates so much of what we have seen during the 3 days of this conference. I think the best thing would be to ask if there are questions to Chana about her talk, to begin with it. I have to begin with it. It's a very very precise and maybe it's a detail, but I was very curious when you presented us the poem Senile, I don't know how to pronounce it. I was curious by about the translation of the personal pronoun meret, that you have translated they and not we. And I was wondering if there was some questioning around the translation of this. I would say because of the inclusiveness of the we and the otherness of the they, and the me Yiddish is in between. So I was wondering if you.
Yeah, it's a very, very good criticism. As I said, you know, this is a translation in progress, and I may change it. But the main thing for me was the fact that, at least in American English, they is used as an equivalent of the impersonal, right, which English does not have. You know, so mezogt, they say that, right? And we really is very marked as a specific group. That is, so they can be non-referential linguistically, like the it.
And was that
it's like the
one
plural of it, right?
Yeah. Was that one of the poems you were able to discuss with Binyamin Harshav, or?
Not at all. No, not at all. This is a poem that he translated completely alone into Hebrew. What I got to do is edit it and after his death. So the poems that he completed translations of, I edited because, you know, he was pretty sick at the end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't see, is there any question from, yeah, I see Saul has a question.
Thank you for this fascinating theory of the Jewish theory of translation. So I just want to note that you began with this idea of a kind of aligned mode of interpretation / translation between Jewish and Muslim textual practices, and sort of ended with a very specific moment of Binyamin Harshav's, his particular mode or entry into this kind of mode of Jewish writing. So what does it mean to call this a Jewish theory of translation, or to name the Jewishness? Does it privilege Jewishness over and against other practices, textual practices within imperial or non-imperial contexts? And what would it mean to cling to and really need that specificity in some way?
Yeah, I mean, it's Jewish only in the sense of a textual and intertextual tradition. So it's a historicizing a move and an attempt to say that we're not the only ones, and that in effect, if this were to be used as against the model of that privileges originality and describes translators as women who are unfaithful to their husbands, right, within that horrible patriarchal set of metaphors, you actually are going against the historicity of translation, even in European cultures, where until the 18th century, there was much less of an emphasis on originality and on the source text as an original, and a much more of a sense of a community of textual transmission. So it's the idea of this kind of bourgeois individualist misappropriation of romanticism and of nationalism that has invaded all of our brains. We take it, you know, to be a law of nature, but it's a construct and a very recent one. And just, you know, Yiddish here, or Jewish, is the dafkedik, right? It's the defamiliarization that allows us to see. I think it's important in itself, and it's important as a bridge between other, you know, Hebrew, Yiddish, Arabic, Persian, and probably Chinese, right? Where you still have to pass poetry tests in order to become a civil servant. So, you know, when you look at all the cultures of commentary together, right, views of translation as collaborative work and transmission, intergenerational transmission, is probably the majority. And we allow these, you know, center to periphery people who excuse imperialism. You know, what can we do? It's a fact that literary circulation goes from Paris to the rest of the world, right? That is something that we can think ourselves out of, and that's why an example from another context and showing how it may actually be majoritarian, or a majority, if not majoritarian, may be helpful.
Thank you very much. I think Daniel has one question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this talk. I wanted to, in a way, join Shoal in asking about the connection between the first part of this lecture and its second part. And I'm thinking particularly about this sentiment that the poem expresses of an excess of sorts of language, the talk and talk and talk. And you're telling us of how Jewish literatures are, or used to be, in a state of translate and translate and translate, or interpret and interpret and interpret. So my question is about that possible connection between multilingualism, or having all these languages, you know, and being Harshav and Haushovsky and Gabi Daniel, and the poem itself.
And I think the answer is the end, is the fact that the decimation of Yiddish multilingualism in the Chum, right? The fact that, and modernity, right? The way in which this becomes a metonymy for the ways in which we're all krishkalach ich, that our sense of community, of collectivity, of the possibility of dialogue that respects tension and difference, right, to go back to the first half, that turns this meret, meret, meret into a shushkin zich, into something that signifies nothing. So he's looking at the world in which the remnants, even as remnants, are being erased, that their language, right, cannot signify. And I think his legacy, at least for me, is to make it legible. But then the reception machine comes in, and there's still this investment in perpetuating the lie, right? That, you know, he's okay as a great scholar of Yiddish, but, you know, he couldn't have continued to write poetry throughout, because once statehood comes in, Yiddish has to die. It's really, really important to see the commitment to monolingualism as a construct that creates the krishkalach ich, that prevents that kind of a continuous collaborative culture of transmission and translation from having its voice and having more than an individual imprint or impact. You know, we really all have to work on this. That's why I call it labor.
Actually, I don't know if I don't see any hands, but I have, if to let people think about
Ronnie
it.
wants,
Ronnie,
wants to say.
sorry, I haven't seen it. Ronnie.
Shalom Aleichem, Ronnie.
Hi, Shalom Aleichem. Sorry, I feel electronically challenged. I wasn't able to find the button. So I also have a question about the first part of your talk, and I wanted to say first that I really appreciated how you gave us these qualifications or thoughts about how and if to engage with broader theories. What does the thought of post-colonialist translation theory, whatever, what these kind of universal perspectives give us, and actually the things that they don't give us, their limitations. And so I was thinking, and this is a very broad question, so maybe you can engage with it however much you want, that Jewish literatures and Yiddish literature particularly also has a very, I don't know, loaded history with colonialism, whether it's, you know, in the case of Palestine and Israel, or in the proposition that several scholars in Jewish studies have had about the position of Jews in Eastern Europe as a colonized position, as inhabiting some sort of colonized relationship with the empires that where they lived. So I was wondering if you had any sort of initial thoughts on what sort of post-colonial Yiddish, particularly Yiddish, frame of reference could look like.
Right. The post-colonial model is very important, as I said, in pointing out the unequal power relations, right? That, for example, translation of Yiddish into Russian in the Soviet Union, or translation of Yiddish into English in Imperial America, right, would imply. And I think it's very, very helpful for that. But one of the results of post-colonial translation theory was, as I suggested, to label translation itself as a practice that erases agency and that is always oppressive. Now, the important thing is that the relationship between Hebrew and Yiddish may have been more colonial, right, than the relationship between, people are going to scream at me, between Yiddish and Russian during the 1920s. Okay, so this needs to be historicized as well. But what it does not account for, post-coloniality, is the fact that it's not just two, right? We have this obsession with dividing the world into two, or maximum, if you're French, into three. What's fantastic about the example of Yiddish is precisely the lack of Yiddishland. If we don't start and end with the relationship between occupier and occupied, right? King and subject, then we can see the kind of the queer theoretical dimension of looking sideways. The ways, if you explore Yiddish publication during the heyday of modernism, right, the ways in which they move from one city to another, right, even within the larger Soviet Union, arguing with themselves, right, publishing once here, once there, and then yet constructing this totally transnational network that doesn't have a Paris or a New York as a center, but really, you know, despite the Bergelson's Dreizentrum, has many more than that. And the mere debate over it, the fact that Yiddishland is a chronotope in Bakhtin's sense, right? It's made out of words, I think can be a really wonderful, if utopian, alternative to the obsession with the nation state that is so recent, right? That ignores the longer history. And when you look at the history of translation through cultures of commentary, right? Broadly construed, you can have a much more nuanced, multi-directional and messy, right? Relationship. You can talk about contacts between Yiddish and, you know, minor cultures in the Urals or in Eastern, the Asian part of the Soviet Empire, etc. It doesn't always have to go through the major, right? They didn't know they were minor.
Thank you, Chana. I see Valery Dimchitsa's question. Valera.
Thank you. Some sort of a brief remark. When we are discussing the translation as a sort of intertextuality and literature practice, we have to see the difference between two different situations. It's a little bit strange, but we can compare the Yiddish translations from Hebrew and translations from Hebrew into different other Jewish languages. Then the majority of the readers were bilingual. It is a strange comparison, but we can compare the situation with the situation in Russian poetry in the early 19th century. One of the founders of Russian Romanticism, Vasily Zhukovsky, who was mainly a translator, more translator than a poet, translated from English and French and German, and we are sure that majority of his readers were more or less fluent in European languages because we are speaking about Russian nobility. So the pleasure of the reader, the interest of the reader was how you can try to show us that it is possible to rewrite well-known English or French or German text in our own national language, which is a little bit more primitive, which has no such a longer literature history, and so on and so on and so on. Yes. Now we are in quite different situation. People translating, for example, from Yiddish into Russian, other European English, other languages, because we believe that the majority of a potential audience has no idea how to read and understand what is written in Yiddish or some other languages of minorities. Yes, it's quite another pragmatic. And what you described us about the Harshav's, the beginning of Harshav's career, when he was both active in Hebrew and in Yiddish. He was on the border from Shvel. He was on the border, very tragic border, destruction of the previous situation when both languages were in usage inside the what we may say educated part of a Jewish society, Jewish intelligentsia, and quite a new situation when Jewish audience became monolingual, or Yiddish, or Hebrew, or something else. And this is the specific of the situation, as I understood. Yes. So the previous situation, then you can. Each reader could compare the original and the translator was quite far from this colonial, as you told us, colonial new cultural colonialism.
Right. No, thank you. This is absolutely correct. And the important thing is that when you have a situation where the multilingualism is denied, but is very much active, right? You can actually look at a community, right, of translational activities where you, in the opening years of Likrat, of the founding group of Israeli poetry called, right, the statehood generation, right? So all of this happens after 48, with the exception of Aharon Almog. They were all native speakers of Yiddish, and they were all bilingual. And one of the things that he did, Rushovsky then, or Hey Binyamin, right? He's the only one who already had a book out, right? Stoipen, even though he was very young. So basically, they were, as they were developing the manifestos for the statehood generation poetry, right? The first kind of Israeli Hebrew poetry that became hugely influential. They were very active translating the poetry of especially the high modernists in Yiddish, who were tremendously influential, right? And they worked at it, and they couldn't get it and Benjamin couldn't get it published because, right, they who wanted, so it took 10 years to publish, but still it ended up via the Hebrew translation being very, very influential. Just like a generation before that, Sholem Aleichem became a Hebrew writer, a Hebrew classics through the mediation of his son-in-law, Berkeley. And people don't know, Israelis don't know that Sholem Aleichem is not a Hebrew writer, or is not mainly a Hebrew writer. So I would, I mean, I take under advisement the change, the cultural change into monolingualism, especially when it's state demanded or state policed. But I also think that it's never fully successful. And of course, now it's with majoritarian languages like English, but you still have in the European community multilingualism as the norm. So I don't think that model is dead. I think it's just thinking about it in terms of
maybe it's some sort of returning.
Yeah, in terms of oppressor and oppressed, you know, the post-colonial thing is very important, but it is very specific to the British colonial history and the way in which they use translations to mainly translate, for example, the classics of Indian literature into English, right, in order to educate the native speakers of those languages, because, and I quote, these natives deserve some Englishing, right? So that's very, very different, you know, from what was going on in translating Yiddish into Russian in the Soviet Union, or translating Yiddish into English with the collaboration of the major writers. For example, in the case of Abramovich, I'm sorry, of Bashevis, right, in New York. It's really, really, it requires a very specific historicization.
Yeah.
One brief note about the Hebrew-Israel classic Sholem Aleichem in Berkovich translations. One of the most famous, the most well-known novels about the Second World War written in Russian, which is something everybody read it and everybody knows because it was a part of the school curriculum. A novel written by Emanuel Kazakevich, Zvezda, the Star. Nobody knows, or it's something which was forgotten, that it's auto translation from Yiddish. It was even published in Yiddish. Quite soon he translated himself into Russian and became Russian classic. Absolutely.
What is it called in Yiddish? Do you know what it's called in Yiddish?
The Green Schottens, 1948.
I learned something important. Wow.
And it's absolutely mainstream about the Second World War, Russian army, and so on and so on. Wonderful novel, meanwhile.
Thank you, Valera. I think I see Yakov Ershkovich want to say something.
Thank you. I wanted to go from the macro maybe to the smallest, to the Stäuben, to the smallest particles, but I want to first say that it was a pleasure to be here for the past 3 days, and I want to thank everyone from Saul and on for a wonderful conference. Good job to all the organizers. And I wanted to ask about Stäuben, which, as you noted, was the title of his book, and also does a lot of work in this poem, also with the crumbs and the crumbling speech at the beginning. And if you could say a little bit more about this figure of this irregular figure of the dusts in his poetry, but also, and this may be pushing it a bit, I'd like to hear what you think, if we can think of dusts as this kind of stand-in for translation, this something that lingers in the crevices, that maybe highlights fissures and really permeates everything. And it's like this translational understanding of Jewish culture. It's everywhere and yet almost indiscernible. So, but that might be pushing it.
No, I love that. I love that. You know, the way in which the one or that which has been rubbed out actually permeates everything. And especially in, you know, when he served in the army, that became in 48. But as you said, Steuben preceded it, and but it didn't precede Ben-Gurion's initial coinage of that term, which I think was in 45 or 40. It was very close to the war in 46. The most powerful part of that metaphor for me is the grammar, the way that he, what the Russian formalists call the thematization, right? The word stoib, avak, right? Translating avak into stoib and then pluralizing it, showing we're everywhere, right? You can't just, you know, clean us away, sweep us under the rug. And I really think in this particular poem, the English idiom of sweeping something under the rug is the organizing kind of matrix of the image schema, if you will. But Steuben as a first poetry book still stands up as one of the greatest kind of modernist, or maybe the last insichistisch book or oeuvre. It's totally amazing and really should be taught and written about.
Thank you very much. I don't see any hand. Anyway, I would like to open the discussion if anyone has something to say, not only about Hannah's talk, but about the whole conference. We have some time for discussion. I have not noticed something today which I find very interesting, that nearly all the talks we've heard have had a relationship with smuggling in some way. There has been, and the problem that translations are faced to with when they have to do with power. When Alexandra talked about Masharo Niskaite, Gennady brought the problem of the redactorship and how much they mingled in the process. And even the talk of Daniel was about smuggling, in the sense that there's something maybe always illegal with Yiddish, or there's this sense of being in some way illegal in transmitting it. And what you said about Harshav's relationship with his own production in Yiddish after 48 is just really striking in this perspective. So well, that was one reflection, and I don't know if we have other remarks or anything. If we don't, I really want to thank everyone for having come to take part to the conference. I want to thank my co-organizers. I really want to thank Brian, who helped us so much with the logistics. And let's continue to be smugglers. And I hope to see you very soon and to talk once more about this topic.
And we will send very soon a message about the continuation because there will be some about the publications, of course, but there will be also some more surprise. Yes or no? Do you agree?
The last word is to our son Gabriel.
Who is bilingual? Who is bilingual, right?
Yeah, he's speaking Russian right now.
Thank you guys so much for a wonderful 3 days. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We'll
Thank
be
you.
really happy to
Bye.
see you soon.
Bye-bye. Seid gesund alle.
Seid alle
Thank
gesund.
you, everybody.
Gesund.
Take care.
Gesund.
Seid gesund.